Louisiana, and has helped to organize groups across the state and work with citizens who are concerned about problems. And she's going to tell you about a site near her home and difficulties that citizens have had in trying to get their concerns about environmental impacts addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. Good morning to all of you. It is a great pleasure to be here this morning to share with you some personal experiences with all field waste facilities. I am really excited that conferences such as this is starting to take place. This provides some much needed information so citizens can have some knowledge of what is out there in areas that could be seriously endangering their health while destroying our air, water, and soil. I will briefly tell you a little about myself. In 1979, my life changed. Prior to that, I was like many people, and by that I mean I went to work, returned home, and lived a normal life. I would never have dreamed of addressing a group of people like I am doing today. Things change. You must get involved, and it is up to you to make changes, especially when the health of your loved ones is being affected. Anyone who sells their souls to make big bucks sure doesn't amount to much in my opinion. Our natural resources are being destroyed. Our cancer rate is the highest in the nation for some to make those big bucks. We can and must stop this from continuing. The technology is available today. My first involvement was a solid waste landfill. I found out that unless people demand enforcement and get involved, many of our laws never get enforced. After several years of fighting and extensive litigation, I saw the results of my efforts. We won our lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court. The facility is today closed. That experience probably happened for a reason. I would have never gotten involved and would have continued trusting that we were being protected by our agencies. In 1988, I found myself dealing with an oil field waste facility. This facility in my area had been in operation for a number of years. You cannot see a thing from the roads in the area. I was so curious about this site that I began to ask questions. Mars Services, a commercial, non-hazardous oil field waste disposal facility located on the border of St. Landry and Lafayette parishes. The facility operates an injection well along with the land forming operations for several years. All seem to be rolling smooth, with numerous waste trucks arriving in all directions. Profits rolling in at the expense of our natural resources. A rude awakening was fixing to take place and has taken place in the last couple of years. I was very suspicious of levees I observed being constructed in the fall of 1988. Levees that today have proven to be constructed out of contaminated waste. I checked with the Office of Conservation and found out that Mars Services was in the process of putting an incinerator at that location. This incinerator was permitted to someone else in another parish. Mars Services had discussed the incinerator and that had not continued to proceed, but I wanted to make sure it would not happen. Working with the local priests, the mayor, and aldermen of Kington, the people in the community, I held a town meeting to inform citizens of my findings. Most of these people had no idea of what this site did. After much effort, the incinerator was not allowed to locate at Morris Services. The permit holder, after being delinquent of non-payment of their permit, had their permit revoked by the Department of Environmental Quality. We were excited, but had yet greater problems facing the area. Several trips to Baton Rouge doing research on Morris Services had revealed to me the groundwater contamination down to 60 feet beneath the site. The Chico Aquifer serves 15 parishes of South Louisiana, which is greatly threatened by this facility. The Chico Aquifer has been declared by EPA as the sole source aquifer. What a disgrace for us to allow such threats to exist. Records in the Office of Conservation show that over a long period of time, there were several problems at that facility. We were able to get representatives from the Department of Environmental Quality and the Office of Conservation to come to our small village and try to explain to the citizens what was taking place. For after all, we were drinking the water from that very area. Neighbors at this site were having extreme swelling, and after getting off of the water, at the recommendation of their doctor, the swelling was quickly gone. The cancer rate in the area would be interesting to be compared with other areas. With increasing curiosity of what the site looked like, and wishing to be a bird, so I would be able to see behind the fields and trees, I rented a plane and a pilot. I borrowed a camcorder. I purchased 10 rolls of film, and I carried a camera to get a good bird's eye view. I had never flown in a small plane. The weather was terrible. We had gotten a downpour the night before with continuing rains all morning. I told my boss I was taking a long lunch period. My co-workers said I had to be crazy to go in such conditions. So off to lunch I went and returned safely and so overwhelmed. What my bird's eye view greatly increased my fears for that area. The water pond that was supposed to be strictly water had a great-looking oil slick. 2 large trucks parked by the Pueblo facility left in an extreme hurry after we were spotted making several trips around. That facility uses the same entrance as Morris Services, so you could not distinguish what sites the midnight trucks were going to. The Pueblo site was not to be in operation at the time we saw the 2 trucks there. I understand that this site is under FBI investigation at the present time. There is reason to believe that hazardous waste was pumped into that line, and that all may have been received in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I'm sorry, not all. Hazardous waste might have been received in Baton Rouge. Compliance orders were issued by the Office of Conservation on several issues. Those were totally ignored by Morris Services. Conservation scheduled a hearing to obtain answers from Morris Services as to why they were not complying. We rented a bus to attend the hearing in Baton Rouge. A penalty of $10,000 plus $600 hearing cost was imposed as a result of that hearing. Morris Services then filed a lawsuit against the Office of Conservation. Conservation was enforcing a law, and then they get sued. Do you think the state trooper that gives you a speeding ticket should be sued for enforcing the law? It just doesn't make good sense to me, and that is what happened when our agency tried to enforce the law. CLAW, which stands for Kingston Cleaners of Land, Air, and Water, and the League of Women Voters of Louisiana, contacted the Tulane Environmental Law Funding for assistance in filing on our behalf to join the lawsuit supporting the Office of Conservation. Our request was accepted. We are so very grateful for the excellent service and the work that was provided to us. It is so unfortunate that organizations and citizens do not have the funds to hire attorneys on these environmental destructive people. Later, more violations led to another penalty being imposed for $15,000. More services permit was suspended, and no waste could be accepted at the landform or the injection well. We were so excited that finally no more additional waste would be added to increase the contamination already existing. In July of this year, Mars Services was granted a hearing for them to provide information on the changes they claimed had taken place. It was a lengthy hearing at which the citizens felt not much had changed. Many of the people in attendance observed that most questions could not be answered by their so-said new president. The attorney responded immediately, leading us to believe that the new president does not know much of what's going on. The shareholders are all the same, and the only person that was actually changed was by title. We now have a president by the new name, with the old one as manager of that facility. So who does conservation deal with when they arrive at the site? The same old story, Morris Keltier. The new man, Peter Nicolosi, is nowhere to be found. Just ask for him or call for him and see if he's available. His office said this week they had no idea where he was or how he could be reached. We have received a decision from the commissioner on that hearing. On August the 29th, the permits are no longer suspended. However, no waste of the landform can be accepted at the present time. A surety bond in the amount of $528,000 was accepted. An order earlier issued to the First National Bank to pay the letter of credit in the amount of $100,000 was rescinded. All the penalties were paid and the lawsuit was dropped. Conservation is still requiring a detailed plan and implementation relative to remediation of the groundwater problems remain unsatisfied today. Evidence of compliance can be presented and received and evaluated administratively without the necessity of a public hearing. I feel certain it's only a matter of time before the waste is entering those gates once again. Our ex-senator, Ed Gamuto, today also shareholder in Mars Services, stressed that the oil-filled waste is non-hazardous and cited the need for the facility to reopen as oil production in Louisiana may escalate with the present crisis we have in oil. CLAW has gained national recognition with Renew America's Searching for Success program. A certificate is displayed in Mayor Elmer Broussard's office in Canton. I filed with EPA to have a preliminary assessment of the site done to determine if it should be on the National Superfund priority list. The first portion of the assessment revealed sufficient evidence to warrant further study. EPA's investigation presently continues. 3 sites in Vermilion Parish is on the Superfund list. All of those sites accepted the same identical waste as Mars Services. I want to add at this point that the Department of Environmental Quality has issued a compliance order for improper discharge of water into the Bayou Campgrow. That bayou is a recharge zone for the Chico Aquifer. The waste is now off-site, therefore DEQ could get involved. I have serious trouble to understand how non-hazardous oil field waste sites are ending up on the National Superfund list. Well, maybe, just maybe, it is because it is just as hazardous and our lawmakers have simply overlooked the issue. On the Mars Service Facility, I would be interested in knowing how an ex-senator became a shareholder so quickly. I am just a simple countrywoman with no high-quality education, so I guess that is why I seem to think that if you have benzene or toluene, whether it be in water, milk, oil, or in any other form, it would still be hazardous with no doubts at all. I surely must have missed out on some of the classes that some lawmakers definitely attended. My involvement led me to testify on numerous occasions before legislative committees regarding off-field waste and 29B regulations. Stories about Mars services appeared throughout the state and even at the national level. A front-page colored picture was featured in the Times-Picayune. Excellent coverage by newspaper and television made the citizens aware of the seriousness of this site. I would like to urge all of you to spread the word and get involved. Start working on your elected officials to have all field waste listed as hazardous, because that is exactly what it is. It is up to each one of us to make things happen. We do have that responsibility as stewards of this earth. What will our grandchildren think of us if we do not clean up what we have allowed to happen to our land? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. I'll take just ordinary countrywoman any day to be able to do that much. She has done a tremendous amount. Our next two speakers, before I mention them, apparently people have been complaining about the temperature in the room, and I've been informed that they normally run it cool because in the afternoon the sun comes in and it gets pretty warm in the room, but a request has been made and they have said they will raise the temperature for us. Also, we're not going to take the break that's on the program, so if you want to get some coffee or water or something, try and do it as quietly as possible. I guess because I was so long-winded and nobody was up here to cut me off, and we got started a little late. But I'd like to introduce, if you come up, Maureen O'Neill and Terry St. Pay. Maureen I first met Maureen when she was, y'all want to come up together or one at a time? Okay. Used to be with the Surge and Water Board when Jim Bob Moffitt wanted to put all that gypsum in the Mississippi River. And Maureen was just terrible. Worked day and night to stop it. And I had the pleasure of working with her there. And she has been, I think, one of the best things that's ever happened to the state of Louisiana in water quality and the job she's done with the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. And she's a real shaker and mover, and one of her, I guess, leaders and examples in life, Mildred Fauché is down at Mildred, would you stand up just a second? Oh, stand up. The mayor couldn't be here today, but Mildred is the environmental conscience of the city of New Orleans, and particularly the mayor. And she's shy and bashful, but don't let that little outside exterior fool you. She's wonderful. But anyway, she's encouraged Maureen and discouraged her from getting out of all this. But Maureen, you take it.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm glad to be here, and I'm real glad to see this group. It's real timely. We need your help. I want to tell y'all some things that are going on, and certainly there is a good window of opportunity for those of you that are concerned about oil and gas waste in the state of Louisiana. I want to talk a little bit about where we were, where we are today, and where we're going. I think that but we have tremendous problems in this state, and there is certainly no point in denying that. One of the things I was interested in, I think everybody's interim in the environmental community right now, is when you talk about oil field waste and it's non-hazardous. I think there's a number of us that are talking about linguistic detoxification. How do you take something that is incredibly hazardous to try and placate the public that there's no problem? You label it non-hazardous. Well, I think a lot of this has been going on for a long, long time, and a lot of these things certainly need to be changed, and there are some opportunities to do that. We do have some good movements. We are moving in the way of pit closures. During this administration, we have been able, in fact, to pass a bill through the legislature, and the pits are being closed. It is taking a long, long time, but at least that is on a good path. I think we've got increased understanding of the damages that is caused by toxic waste in general, oil and gas waste in particular. Most of the regulatory agencies, I think, are paying increased attention. I know when I came to DEQ, I was just really amazed that there was no systematic regulation of the discharges from oil and gas operations into the waters of this state. And one of the favorite tricks has always been with regulatory agencies is you give them all this authority and then you make sure they have absolutely no money to enforce anything, or you discourage them in any other number of ways possible. Well, I'm very happy to say that because of the fact that we have had a supportive administration, we have been able to build up a permitting and an enforcement staff, and we have taken a number of actions. It's still far, far from where it needs to be, but at least it's happening. There has been a lack of enforcement not only in Louisiana, but certainly in this country. And the federal government recently released an Inspector General's report. And the Inspector General is housed at EPA in Washington. He was incredibly critical of Region 6. And again, it's easy to beat on Region 6 like any other regulatory agency, but they simply have not had the funds nor the political mandates to go out there and to deal with oil field waste. But there has been a lack of enforcement. That's an interesting document, and for those of you that haven't seen it, it would be some interesting reading. Where we are right now is we have some regulations that we have just put out, and I think that we can safely say we seem to have a lot of interest in these regulations, so we must be doing something right. I don't know what the final regulations will look like, but these are regulations governing what can go into the waters of this state. We brought a number of copies today. They're out at the desk. I would strongly urge you to pick up a copy of these regulations and to take a look at them. I would like to say that certainly I think Harry is going to speak to the study that he did in the wetland area of Louisiana, but I think that you will see from this that we have incredibly high levels of contaminants in these wastes. We certainly have the salinity, which is important because it can kill the vegetation that hold the wetlands together. For those of you that are interested in wetland issues, if you want to save what little we've got, we absolutely have got to stop what is going out there right now. Besides the salinity, we've got heavy metals, which can be picked up by the fish. We have organic chemicals, and certainly, and in my mind, one of the most significant releases is we have massive releases of radiation going into our wetlands right now. And again, I think that Carrie can go over some of the data for the 4 particular sites. But one of the things that we did is we passed a regulation approximately a year and a half or so ago, requiring everybody that was discharging into the waters of Louisiana that they had to test for radiation and toxicity. The levels are shockingly high. There is a fact sheet that we also have out at the front desk, and I would also urge you to pick up a copy of that. And hopefully that might be of help. One of the things that we have consistently heard, which is a real source of irritation to me, is the economics of this, and the fact that we are going to cost the oil and gas money. Well, yes, we are going to cost the oil and gas industry money. Of course we are. One needs to properly take care of their waste. For so long in this state, I think we had this idea that you didn't need to. And I would assume that most of you in this room are paying for your sewage costs and you're paying for your waste. The polluter needs to pay for his waste. And we cannot allow this to continue going out in the manner that it has been going out. There has been a phase out. These discharges are not allowed everywhere, but they're still allowed in far too large of numbers. in and of itself is not that interesting, but it's very important. We start a regulatory process. Right now, these regulations that we have up front are in draft stage. This is the time to really look at it and make comments. And Dwayne, would you stand up so everybody will know who you are? This is Dwayne Chisholm, who works with oil and gas permitting. Dwayne is the good contact person for these regulations. We are encouraging participation. We have given them to the regulated industry. We have given them to Mid-Continent. We have given them to LAPRO. We have given them to the environmental community, and anybody else that's interested can certainly have them. But we want people to comment on these. We will be starting the formal process within a month or so. There will be a public hearing. We don't get to really pick when these public hearings are. There is a law called the Administrative Procedures Act. You don't have a lot of choice when you hold these things. It appears that the public hearing could be in December. If you are not physically able to go to the public hearing, which will be in Baton Rouge, I would certainly encourage at least a letter. But if you can only go to one meeting, I would encourage you to go to the Louisiana legislature. That is the last step of the process. The rules go to them for oversight. And for those of you that have been working in environmental issues, I think that you're quite well aware of the fact that industry is able to hire some very, very good folks. They have got some very good lobbyists that certainly know their way to Baton Rouge. But I think I'm also real proud to say that I have seen the environmental community really grow in that area, and I think that it's safe to say there's certainly no slouches there either. But it's important that you get involved, because otherwise you are just going to have one side of the story, which is the industry side of the story. They absolutely need to be heard. They have every right to be heard. But there's going to be something very, very wrong if the environmental side is not heard also. That is the only way to hopefully keep these things in kilter, and hopefully to get to the point where we can phase out these discharges. One of the things that we would like to do is make sure that if you are interested in being notified about public hearings or legislative meetings, that we can do that. There's some staff folks here from DEQ that came down from Baton Rouge today, and I'm going to just ask them to stand and identify themselves so that if you're interested, you want to give them your name, address, and phone number, we will let you know when these meetings are. So, Jan, you want to make a start?
Jan Boydston, I'm the non-point source program and Office of Water Resources. Jan Boydston, non-point source program, Office of Water Resources, DEQ.
Okay, Doug's here too. Where's Doug? Okay, and Dwayne identified himself. Am I missing anybody? Okay, all right. Okay, well, I would strongly urge you to give your name, address, and phone number if you want to know about the process and if you want to be involved. Don't forget to pick up those regulations and/or the fact sheet. I think you'll find it helpful. And before Kerry starts his presentation, I would just like to really urge everybody in this room to try to remember that I think it's time that we put Louisiana first, because I can promise you nobody else is. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. She has been really a real inspiration and a tremendous help to a lot of folks across the state. I first met Carrie St. Pay about 15 years ago when I used to work as director of the Louisiana Wildlife Federation, and I thought, wow, here's a really dedicated, hardworking little guy who really takes all this pollution stuff seriously and is trying to do something about it. And when Maureen became head of water quality, I told her that I thought that she could do anything to help Kerry out there in the field, because he was typing all of his own memos and reports. I don't think he even had a boat back then. Certainly didn't have an airplane. And he covers about 8 parishes, include Terrebonne, Lafourche, and all those other places, where the only place you can get to some of these waste sites is by boat. And he has to cover all spills that occur out there and all sorts of other things. And that's improved a little bit. But I would say that he's still one of the most dedicated, hardworking inspectors in the state of Louisiana. And a reflection of that, a few years ago, the EPA was trying to look at the impact of oil and production waste around the United States. And they picked Louisiana, Alaska, I believe Oklahoma, Texas, and a few other places. And most damage cases that they found in the United States were in Alaska and Louisiana. And the most documented report, or
Thanks, Willie. Good morning, everyone. I was asked to speak to y'all today to give y'all more or less the results of our latest research on the subject of produced water discharges. We'll be giving the same, our version of this presentation next week to the International Symposium. It's going to be held this coming week. Enjoying previous speakers, heard a lot of good comments. My slides here are not going to be totally of the type that we usually show in presentations that we give. Many of them very similar to Willie's.
I speak today and declined for a couple of different reasons. There is going to be a conference here in New Orleans next week, national conference on oil and gas, put on by industry and EPA and some other groups that basically we don't have a lot of participation here today by industry representatives. Jim Welch, see you here, Jim? Good, in that. Let's come on up. Jim is, I don't know his exact title today, but he has been the director of the underground injection and surface mining involved with pipeline safety and that sort of thing in the Office of Conservation, which is in the Department of Natural Resources. It's been a very difficult job for him because their agency has been severely understaffed and underfunded. One thing that in working with the Office of Conservation is they've always been very good at providing information to citizens when they come in, actually help them get information, make space available, and that sort of thing. And he's had a very frustrating job because the citizens come in and scream at him when all companies are out there dumping in the environment, and he doesn't have anybody to send out and do anything about it. And up until now, the Office of Conservation has no money and no people to go out and take samples of these sites to make sure that the industries are cleaning them up correctly. So I introduce you to a very frustrated public official, Jim Welch. Thank you. Who's our light technician here? Bob?
You're on the wall, really straight
Where?
to the left.
Right here?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Really appreciate that long introduction. We really did hit on a lot of the problems that conservation has. But today I've been asked to talk on our enforcement efforts, statewide order 29B and so forth, so that's what I'll do. And also have some comments on the DEQ proposed regs and some other things. The Office of Conservation is within the Department of Natural Resources, and it's empowered by Louisiana Statute Title 30 to regulate the subsurface disposal of both hazardous and non-hazardous injection material injection wells, as well as the surface facilities that are incidental to the oil and gas exploration and production. Oil and gas drilling and production had its beginning in Jennings, Louisiana in 1901. Waste drilling fluids and produced water have been stored or disposed of in earthen pits or impoundments for 89 years. Such waste storage and disposal practices are certainly a potential for contamination of groundwater, marshes, wetlands, and soils if the pits are not constructed, operated, and closed properly. Known as an amendment to Statewide Order 29B, the Office of Conservation promulgated comprehensive environmental regulations on January 20th, 1986, which specifically addressed the storage of oil field waste in earthen impoundments and provided specific criteria for operation and closure of such pits in an environmentally sound manner. This was truly a first for our state of Louisiana. Historically, as in most other producing states, early regulations did not emphasize environmental protection. They more or less only addressed safety. This lack of environmental emphasis has caused many Louisiana citizens, as well as government agencies such as ours, to become concerned for general health and welfare with regard to oil field waste disposal practices. Regulation of the oil and gas industry by conservation was first initiated in 1943 with the first promulgation of Statewide Order 29B. This order has been amended over 30 times since then, and each amendment affects a different phase of the oil and gas industry. And many people think it's ironic that it took from 1901 to 1986 for our state to adopt some meaningful environmental regulations. That's 85 years of ongoing contamination and pollution, all done not in any violation of any laws. There were none. One now begins to understand the core of some of the environmental problems present in Louisiana. What is oil field waste, and why is it considered non-hazardous? Non-hazardous oil field waste, known as NOW, is currently defined as waste generated by the drilling and production of oil and gas wells, which is not regulated by the provisions of the Louisiana Hazardous Waste Program. Such wastes include salt water, oil-based drilling mud, water-based drilling mud, completion fluids, pit sludges, storage tank sludges, oily sands and solids, formation water, rainwater from ring levees, washout water, natural gas plant processing water, waste from commercial oil field disposal facilities, and material used in oil spill cleanup operation. You'll notice all of these categories are generic, unspecific. If a waste cannot be characterized as one of the above, it cannot be disposed of in one of the conservation-regulated commercial facilities. What was the impetus to pass such regulations after some 85 years of essentially no environmental regulation? The process apparently began in 1978 with the passage of the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, known as RCRA, which included regulations for the storage and disposal of drilling muds and produced water. Through the national lobbying efforts of the oil and gas industry, drilling fluids, produced waters, and other waste associated with the exploration, development, and production of crude oil or natural gas or geothermal energy were exempted from the regulations as hazardous waste by the solid waste amendments of 1980. The U.S. EPA was given 2 years by this 1980 amendment to initiate and complete a study to determine the hazardous potential or adverse effects of such waste on the environment. The study was to have determined the adequacy of existing state, federal regulatory programs to control and mitigate any hazards, potential changes to regulatory programs to improve control and mitigation of these hazards, and the cost and the impact of those changes on the exploration, development, and production of crude oil and natural gas. 6 months after completion of the study, a determination was to be made as to whether or not the regulations related to oil and gas waste needed to be promulgated on the federal level, the national level. As a result of a lawsuit brought against the EPA by the Alaska Center for the Environment in the fall of 1985, EPA finally began the required study in the spring of 1986. As I understand, Mr. Tonetti of EPA will speak to you either next or the speaker after. So I'm not going to report to you any of the EPA results that were presented to Congress. But I will say that conservation agents accompanied the EPA consultants and arranged for some of the sampling that was done as to the different types of waste sites around the state. Now, on a related matter, the Interstate Oil Compact Commission, better known as the IOCC, which is an organization of the governors in the 29 oil-producing states. Well, the IOCC has completed a 2-year study to determine effective regulations, guidelines, and standards for state-level management of oil and gas production waste. The study was done through an EPA grant and was done by a committee comprised of 12 regulatory officials and a 9-member advisory committee. The advisory committee, there were 3 from regulatory agencies, there were 3 from industry, and there were 3 from public interest and environmental groups. The study is quite detailed and lengthy, and time doesn't permit me to discuss all of the studies. But I imagine this study will be discussed next week at the EPA conference on all field waste in the city. But what I've done, I've gone through the study and I've looked at Louisiana statewide order 29B, and I've identified some areas that I feel are either lacking, missing, or weak in 29B that I personally would like to see us adopt or move toward adoption. First, we need identification of specific emergency conditions that would warrant immediate corrective action by an operator for protection of public health and the environment. 29B allows conservation to make a determination that an emergency exists, but it's not specific. We need really specific things to tell our inspectors what to look for, so we can immediately seal wells, revoke permits, things of this nature. We need specific procedures for calculating penalty amounts that include factors such as economic benefit resulting from the violation. It doesn't seem at all proper for a violator to profit economically from a violation. So whatever profit was made should certainly be figured into any civil penalty. We need to be requiring an operator to develop a contingency plan for waste release prevention and control. It's self-explanatory. We need to provide for dissemination of program information to the regulated industry and to the public. I think DEQ does that very well with their monthly, I believe it is, publication on DEQ activities. It's broken out by division, the air people, the water people, whatever. It's real easy to determine what's going on to citizens or industry or whatever. I think that's a good publication. We need to have a requirement for security bonds to assure the proper plugging and abandoning of wells if an operator fails to do so. It's a real problem in the state. Wells not getting properly plugged and abandoned. Thousands of these wells. We need to have better control of all field waste the haulers or the transporters. Conservation requires a manifest on every load of waste that basically originates with the generator, followed by the transporter, and then to the disposer. I think we have pretty good regulations on the generator and the disposer, but we're real weak in the middle part of that. We need to beef that up. We need to provide data to the public for location of closed oil field waste sites. That information needs to be available to someone that's thinking of purchasing property or something. They need to know what's gone on there in the past. That information needs to be accessible. We need to have a more specific waste management program for oil and gas operators or generators that include requirements for source reduction, recycling, and treatment and proper disposal of their waste. And lastly, we need proper on-site testing of the chemical characteristics of primary concern in all field waste. And those primary concerns are organic content, pH, salinity, H2S content, and ignitability. So there are more things that could certainly help 29B, but these are 9 of the major things. I would like to tell you, though, that Conservation Commissioner Pat Batchelor, chaired one of these committees on the ILCC, the administrative committee, that put these suggestions together that will be presented to EPA. Mr. Batchelor, I think, has taken a real interest in all field waste and other environmental issues in the state. We're all real glad of that. But anyway, back to Louisiana's ongoing efforts to regulate and enforce program, which is 29B. In addition to off-site disposal and commercial facility regulations, the new Order 29B provided a 3-year period in which oil and gas operators were required to do 3 things. Provide an inventory of all pits which existed as of January 20th, 1986. They were pit inventory included a plan and a schedule of abandonment for all pits to be closed. Conservation originally estimated that there were approximately 20,000 oil field pits existing in Louisiana. However, operators have reported only 12,928 pits to our office, and these are the very latest numbers. The reported pits are currently entered into Conservation's computer management system. A field audit is currently ongoing to verify the accuracy and completeness of the reported pits. Operators who fail to report their pits are subject to assessment and civil penalties. Now, our latest statistics also show that there are 6,448 pits that have been removed from service. There are 1,662 pits that will remain in use. They've been retrofitted and are reported to be in compliance. There are 4,817 pits that still have no status. Now, almost all of these pits are located up in northeast Louisiana. They're very small pits in the Monroe gas field near the city of Monroe. They're very small pits, and they're associated with dry gas wells. There's no oil production. So the engineering division is still working on classifying these 4,870 pits. We sent out a questionnaire in 1989 to industry to get a feel for what closing and retrofitting these pits is costing. The results of that study indicated $77.6 million is what was expended to do this, $77.6 million. Now, there are other costs involved in closing pits. There's some secondary costs. Also, the industry reported $5.3 million was the cost for new injection wells. $42.7 million were new facility constructions or additions. $4.4 million were for increased hauling and disposal costs. $1.3 million were for other related costs. So you add these numbers up for a total to close, retrofit, and all the secondary costs. The grand total that industry reported in '89 was $131.3 million. Representative Randy Roach authored a bill last year that provided each pit located in the inland tidal waters, lakes bounded by the Gulf of Mexico, and saltwater marshes. The pits shall be closed by January of 1993. Additionally, his law disallows any new pits in the coastal areas and provides our office the authority to promulgate new regulations and to assess fees for implementation of this law. On June the 6th, Conservation had a public hearing on our proposed new regulations, and the new 29B amendment is scheduled for promulgation in October of next month, in October. By the way, there were over 1,500 pits that were inventoried in the coastal parishes of Louisiana. Now, in the area of pits, there's some real jurisdictional misinformation that's been floating around for a number of years. And I'm speaking of the numerous pits that were in existence when an earlier 1980 version of 29B was put into effect. Now, these pits were being used at that time and before that time as commercial waste pits. Now, these commercial pits, and a number of them are located in Vermilion Parish that we all know about, such as Pad, Lalou, Roy Young, Gulf Coast Vacuum, DL Mud, and some others. These pits were originally constructed by the landowners or with the landowner's permission, simply to make a fast buck. I can imagine the landowner said back then, come on, bring me your waste, 2 bits a barrel, come on, the more the better. Well, the sad part about that is nobody was breaking any regulations. There were no regulations. There were no agencies in charge of this type of waste. So that's how those things got started. Everything was legal. And back then, no one knew the necessity of separating hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste.
not one of these pits that I've just mentioned in Vermilion Parish ever received a final operating permit from conservation. Now, a number of these pits are abandoned. They're just sitting there. They're causing pollution, contamination. Even some are even on the Superfund list. Correctly so. It's where they should be. The pits are misclassified, in my opinion, as all field waste pits. They contain all field waste, true, but they also contain most any other kind of waste. In my opinion, DEQ's Abandoned Sites Division, or EPA, should close these pits, be responsible for closure, using any kind of funding they have available. Superfund money, sure. But I'm not trying to minimize it. These are real problems out there. They need to be addressed. Well, how effective has State Law Order 29B been in other areas? I would like to give you a few statistics and numbers that regard conservation's enforcement efforts. Now, I've gone back over the last 12 months, essentially from July 1989 through June of 1980, and that's what these numbers apply to. So over this past year, conservation inspectors have conducted 15,446 total inspections. These inspections cover the production pits, leases, reserve pits, and injection wells, and then the witnessing of plugging and abandoning of oil and gas wells and injection wells. Conservation has issued 1,387 compliance orders and compliance notices for it, and this 1387 relates to environmental violations. Conservation has a total of 36 inspectors to handle these statewide problems. And we've been authorized this year to hire 10 additional people that, this will certainly help. There's so much more to do. It's really frustrating. These are the first new people that conservation has been authorized to hire in many, many years. The new people, we had a meeting last week, the new people are going to be utilized totally for enhancement of our pit closure verification program, as well as the commercial oil field waste regulatory program. So we're going to continue our efforts to secure additional funding and people. Now, there are a number of legislative bills affecting conservation that passed in this last session. The first one, is a real important one, was a bill by Senator Kelly that made it very clear that it is not necessary for an operator to violate a specific compliance order prior to assessing a civil penalty. Another bill exempted from existing liens on all field property and equipment. That's those items that were being used by a contractor to plug wells or clean sites up under contract to the state. They were in a position of sheriff running out there and seizing their equipment too, so that was a real problem. It was stopping some of our cleanup efforts. Another bill that requires the Office of Conservation to be notified prior to any sheriff's sale on oil and gas equipment. This would allow us an opportunity to go in and put a lien on the equipment, so we get the first money to assure that things are done. We were really getting sidetracked on some of this, so I hope that some of these laws are going to help us out there. There were some other bills that provided additional fees for operators transferring permits into different names. That may sound trivial, but finding responsible parties is a real nightmare when operators of wells change so frequently. They here today, gone tomorrow. It's really a legal nightmare. So we hope this will help us to work with that. And there were other bills that regarding pipelines, alternative fuels, and closer coordination with DEQ and wildlife and fisheries in the issuance of coastal use permits. Now, one bill that we proposed did not make it through the legislature, however. It was proposed that our office was going to impose a fee or a tax on every barrel of waste that was sent into a commercial facility. The monies were to be dedicated strictly for conservation's efforts to enhance our commercial facility regulatory programs. Well, the bill was shot down or killed somewhere in the process, and we really, at the end of the session, thought we were pretty much out in the cold. But thanks to Governor Romer and
the administration, additional general fund dollars were provided to enable us to enhance these two regulatory programs that I mentioned a while ago, the pit closure and the oil field regulatory program. So we're real appreciative of that. And it may be of interest to you to know that conservation has an $8 million total budget, of which only about $1 million comes from state general fund monies. The remaining $7 million comes from fees that we assess industry and also from federal funds. Now, at this time, I'd like to give you another bit of information that might be interesting. Each year, these statistics may be given in different forms, but each year, the oil and gas industry discharges approximately 730 million barrels of salt water into the coastal and offshore areas of Louisiana. It should be understood that conservation does not permit these discharges. We permit none in the state. In fact, 29B prohibits discharges. All such discharges are done under authority of DEQ, and permits have for some years and continue to be issued under their rules and their authority. DEQ is moving toward zero discharge into the coastal area. Last year, I reported to a legislative natural resource committee in Baton Rouge some statistics and the economic impact of such a proposed regulation. As you know, there are basically only two things that can be done with produced salt water. You either discharge it into surface waters under DEQ permit, or you deep well inject it under conservation's permit. Those are the two things that are done. I calculated that it would take about 2,000 new injection wells to handle the 730 million barrels of water injected annually into the coastal waters. The economic impact of drilling and operating these new wells would be a total first-year cost to industry of $520 million. $337 million of that total would be for drilling costs, and $183 million of that total would be to operate the wells per year. Now, I mention those statistics to you for two reasons. First of all, I was asked to compile them for our legislative committee, and secondly, I understand that DEQ is going to use those figures and some other economic figures as part of their required economic, fiscal, and impact statement that they have to prepare when they go through rulemaking. Now, the last thing I would like to mention relates to a specific problem regarding our regulation of the commercial oil field waste disposal facilities. And there are currently 27 active facilities in the state, of which only 8 are capable of handling oil field solids, such as drilling mud and cuttings. The remainder of the commercial facilities are injection wells using closed systems. Our office has suspended operation on 3 of these facilities and is currently conducting efforts to close them according to statewide order 29B. Now, these sites, 2 of them are in Cameron Parish. One is ECO, and the other is Big Diamond. And the 3rd facility is located in Jeff Davis Parish called Castet. Now, these facilities, as well as all other commercial facilities, are required to post closure bonds or letters of credit with our office in order to assure proper closure if the facility goes bankrupt or the owners leave the facility or for whatever. As incredible as it may seem, we have had to go to court twice on these 3 letters of credit to try to collect these letters from the banks. The bankers just don't want to pay without fighting. It's a real concern. We're currently evaluating these problems, and we may find it necessary to further amend 29B to tighten up these financial assurance requirements. The current oil crisis, in the world is certainly producing a boom of some sorts in this country, I guess, and really more so in the oil-producing states, such as Louisiana. And this boom does result in more drilling, more production, i.e. more oil and gas production waste, which it certainly will. I think it's just important, we know this, but I think it's important for the public to support regulatory agencies such as ours, DEQ, any other agency, to keep them properly funded, properly staffed, to assure that the environmental problems in this state can be addressed. I appreciate you coming today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Wilma Subaru was originally asked to respond to not only to the Office of Conservation comments, but to the industry representatives who were going to be here today. And Wilma, I've known for quite a few years, goes out and works with citizens and helps them figure out how to get technical information, figure out what it means. Has helped to organize quite a few groups, has an analytical lab in New Iberia, has done extensive testing across Louisiana and a number of other states over the last 20 years. And can tell you from a technical standpoint and a practical standpoint the types of impacts we've had in the state. Wilma serves as chairman of the Citizen Advisory Committee to the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, serves on the Iberia Emergency Response Right-to-Know program in the state. It's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who I met a number of years ago when she was a student working on her master's, trying to understand a little bit about oyster production in Barataria Bay. And Virginia has grown from that to, I think, becoming one of the finest directors of the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries that we've certainly had in many, many years. Has a very good technical background as a biologist, as Maureen O'Neill always says when she deals with engineers and biologists. She said, give me a biologist any day because they understand natural systems rather than somebody who will design a building or a canal. And Virginia has, I think, been one of the first directors of wildlife and fisheries to say that proposed standards for discharges are not stringent enough. Last year, the Department of Environmental Quality tried to get some regulations adopted to deal with toxic discharges from industrial facilities in the state, and Virginia got up and criticized them because they weren't strong enough and didn't deal with the possible impact of adequate enough toxic impacts on fisheries. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome today Virginia Van Sickle, Secretary of the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. I've been asked to modify the schedule a little bit, but again, for those of you who were not here when I made the announcement, if you want to get on the Department of Environmental Quality's mailing list or questions, right at the door, there's a little sign-up sheet that says DEQ mailing list. A couple of people have signed, and there's some other groups that have information in the back. There's a copy of the Times-Picayune insert series and other information, and a copy of the proposed regulations, which are right by the door. But I've been asked to change the schedule here a little bit. Representative Randy Roach is with us. Representative Roach has not been in the legislature a very long time, but has, I think, been one of those legislators who set a new standard for legislators in terms of concern for human health and the environment. Randy, is he out here somewhere? Oh, okay, good. Just go ahead and come on up. He represents the area which includes all of Cameron Parish and a portion of Calcasieu Parish. And for those of you not familiar, that's on the Louisiana-Texas border. Cameron Parish, I don't remember the population, but it's a very small population because it's almost all coastal marsh. And so he's got a real interest here. And I remember I went to a meeting in Cameron Parish a number of years ago with Concerned Citizens Committee, and the previous legislator representing the district, there was some lights up in front of the place that said, Willie Fontenot will speak tonight on off-field waste. And I got out, and Bill, the first person I ran into was Representative Conway LeBlue, and I knew him. I said, well, Conway, it looks like I finally got my And, but he had to introduce me to the crowd. And the next meeting, he came back to citizens who organized, and he said, "I'm with you. We're gonna fight this thing." So it was like, so here's a guy who replaced my Frank Conway in the legislature. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. I apologize I'm not wearing a shirt and tie, but I do have plans to go back to the LSU game, and it's very hard to watch an LSU game in September in a shirt and tie, so I hope you'll bear with me. What Willie was saying reminded me of a bumper sticker that I just saw as I was trying to find a place to park here on the campus. I'm sure you've seen those bumper stickers, you know, heavy hug a policeman today, this, that, and the other. This one had particular interest to me. It said, defeat an incumbent. So, apparently there's a movement about. I just hope it doesn't hit Cameron Parish before next year. I was asked to give a legislative perspective on the issue of oilfield waste. And I wasn't really sure how I should approach that, and I want to leave some questions, or some time for questions. So I'm going to kind of go through briefly, give you maybe just one legislator's perspective. I always am very careful whenever I speak in front of a group to point out that I'm speaking for myself and not for any other group of legislators, any committee, or anything else. It's just my perspective on what I see or what I perceive to be developing with respect to this issue. Last year, we had, in Cameron, we had a gentleman come in from California. He is an outdoor photographer, and he is a field editor for our magazine called Outdoor Photographer. He came in and he spent a week or so in Cameron Parish and went back, and when he left and got on the plane, he told us that he never knew that anything like coastal Louisiana really existed. He had heard and the general feeling in California and other areas as he wandered about with other outdoor photographers, and he is a fairly well-recognized and nationally recognized photographer. The general consensus was that don't waste your time coming to Louisiana, that the oil and gas industry had already raped and pillaged the coastal wetlands, and there wasn't anything there to see. Well, he went away with a whole different attitude. And he realized, I think, a little bit about what we have down here. In fact, he's coming back this November to spend some more time down here. And I think that it is important that we recognize that where we are right now in terms of regulation, in terms of legislation, is a relatively early part in the development of what I think is a concerted effort in Louisiana to do something about our environmental problems. We look back at 1984, that's when we created the Department of Environmental Quality. A few months after that, that's when we adopted statewide Order 29B. And I assume that you've been discussing 29B because statewide Order 29B is supposedly the regulations that we use throughout the state in order to regulate not only oil field pits and oil field waste in the coastal wetlands of Louisiana, but throughout the entire state, not just in the coastal areas, but throughout the entire state. That caused me a little bit of concern. Last year, we had a committee hearing in the House Subcommittee on Coastal Resources, and we talked about statewide Order 29B, and we talked about where we were with respect to enforcing those regulations. The general consensus was that we were far ahead of any other state, Oklahoma, Texas in particular, in developing a statewide plan to manage the disposal of oil field waste, and that was 29B. But the caveat was, and this is the thing that really caught my attention, was that we really didn't have the money or the manpower to enforce that order. It looked good on paper, so we were told, but really it had been very difficult to enforce it. So we held our hearing, we had our discussions, we wrote letters, we were told there were studies that were being done, there were several suggestions and recommendations being made, and we acted upon some of those. Now, as I was coming in to the conference room, I was told that you had kind of reviewed some of the legislative bills or some of the legislative things that we had passed on in the legislature in the past couple of years. And I won't go into all of that, but I think it's important that you recognize that as a legislature, we have begun to address the problem. We have begun to recognize the problem, but we haven't solved it. I had something else that I wanted to discuss with you before I get into this, but I couldn't help but pick up this article as I was coming in. And we don't get the Morning Advocate in Lake Charles. We can get it on Sunday. And I usually get these clippings, and they're usually sent to me a day or two late. But I think it's appropriate at this particular point as a legislator that I respond, or at least give you an idea as to how I feel about what this letter from Mr. Moore had to say. I think that Louisiana, in general, is a victim of a lack of any type of concerted energy policy throughout the entire United States. You might find that unusual. You might say, well, what does that have to do with oil field waste? If you read between the lines in this letter, it's basically saying that the oil companies and oil producers, be they independents or nationals, they cannot afford to abide by these regulations at current oil prices. And we are now spending $1 billion a month to support our armed services personnel and a massive deployment to support what some people consider to be the way in which we should be paying for oil as far as our American policy is concerned. Now, I think that if we had had perhaps a better energy policy developed, I don't know that we could have avoided the Mideast crisis, but I think that we could have avoided the crisis that I see developing in Louisiana in terms of our inability to get a handle on what oil field waste and oil field production is doing, particularly in the coastal areas of our state. As I look about and read through regulations and read through letters that I get in my office, it's very apparent to me that it all boils down to economics. What can we afford to do? Because we are told by the same departments that are supposed to regulate, they need money. We are told by the people who are involved in the industry that they cannot afford to abide by the regulations. And so, here we go, time and time again, everybody talking about the problem, and just like Mark Twain said, but nobody, they talk about the weather, but nobody seems to do anything about it. I feel like in this next legislative session, it will be imperative that the legislature begin to address the problems. We had that hearing, like I said, last year. And let me go through some of the things that were discussed and some of the responses that we got. First, we were told, when we asked about the apparent inability of the Office of Conservation to really follow through on their auditing of the manifests and following up on exactly what was being done in the oil field, we were told we don't have the manpower and we don't have the ability to follow through. We have a great computer program, we've got a lot of information, but we can't do anything with it. Well, we tried to do something about that in this past legislative session and increase funding in some respects for the Office of Conservation. I would like to know, by the time we come around to the 1991 legislative session, I would like to know what we have done with respect to really improving and monitoring and getting a better handle on how this waste is moving through Louisiana. We had another question that came up in regards to the coordination of the closure of pits. We were very concerned about the fact that the Office of Conservation did not have the manpower and the personnel to go out there and actually survey and see what was being done. We were told there was a memorandum of understanding that was being developed between DEQ and Wildlife and Fisheries as far as how the closure of those pits was supposed to be handled. We suggested to them that we introduce legislation to put into a statute the terms and conditions of that memorandum of understanding. We were told, and during the session, that that was not necessary. I'd like to know before the next legislative session how the memorandum of understanding is actually working, and if in fact the departments are satisfied with what they are doing and how they're handling come in and have a different idea and have a different understanding. I think we ought to take those memorandums and we ought to put them in a statute, so make sure that we can all live by, not just this year, but in the future years as well. In addition, we were told that we should not, at this particular time, adopt a policy to test hazardous waste, to determine just how, test the non-hazardous oil field waste, to determine whether or not it was in fact hazardous. We were told that the Interstate Oil Compact Commission was working with the EPA, and that there would be a meeting in December of 1990, and they would address that problem. They would come up with specific recommendations on how to handle and how to process oil field waste, not just in Louisiana, but throughout the entire United States. We were just told to wait, the study would be finished, and we'd be ready to go in December of 1990. Well, December of 1990 is almost here, and I would be very interested to see what that report suggests, what that report recommends, and I think that we should respond to that report at a minimum, and to at least adopt by statute those recommendations as far as the handling and disposal of non-hazardous oil field waste in Louisiana. I'm also told that that report will also address the problems with the classification of this waste, and will deal specifically with the issue of whether or not we should consider a special classification for this non-hazardous oil field waste. In another area, in dealing with the actual disposal and landforming of this waste, we were told by the Office of Conservation that there was no need to modify statewide Order 29B to increase or to modify and improve the liner requirements for pits that are being used to dispose of this waste. We were told there were no documented instances of groundwater contamination as a result of the handling or disposal of waste in a post-29B pit. I don't know if that's true or not, but even if it's true, even if we can say that there has not been any groundwater contamination yet from waste that was disposed of in a 29B pit, and the significance of 29B is that before 29B, it was virtually unregulated. You could do just about anything that you wanted. And then post-29B, of course, was after the Office of Conservation got together and adopted these regulations in an attempt to try to control what was happening in the area. But even if we can say that in the post-29B era, after the enforcement of these regulations has begun to take effect, that we cannot document groundwater contamination, I think that we can document the fact that groundwater contamination took place in pits prior to 29B. I think we can also look at the DEQ experience and see that clay liners are not sufficient. And in many instances, the waste that we were handling in the oil field has the same type of compounds, the same type of substances that cause other waste in other industrial applications to be considered hazardous. And we should consider, at least at a minimum, upgrading the standards of those liners and improving the regulations in that particular regard. Another problem that is developed is pre-29B pits. Who is responsible for them? Nobody really knows. The Office of Conservation says they should be responsible because it is involving waste that was disposed of in connection with oil field production. And that has historically been their responsibility to deal with regulations involving the oil field. DEQ seems to think that that's their responsibility. Both of them say they need more money and manpower in order to take on that responsibility and do something about it. So I think if you look at what these issues are, consider the responses that we've had from industry, consider the responses that we've had from the departments, I think you'll see that the next session could, if we take a little initiative, be a fairly productive one to at least deal with some of the administrative issues and the administrative concerns and how to handle the waste and how to develop, in a sense, our energy policy, at least in terms of the environmental implications of the oil and gas production in coastal Louisiana. And coastal Louisiana is not just the only area that we're concerned about, but because of the environmental sensitivity of that area, because of the the wetlands because of the estuary production that we have in those particular regions of our state. I think it's imperative that we act, and we act now, in order to address those particular problems. I'd be glad to try to answer any questions if I can. No question? God, that's great. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Roach, and I hope you, those two young fellows with you, enjoy that game. You deserve it. He is one of very hard-working legislators. There are still a few of them out there trying to work with crazy environmental folks to do things. I've been asked to make an announcement. There is a sign-up sheet in the back. Tomorrow morning at 7:30, there's going to be a canoe tour of the Bayou Sauvage, new National Wildlife Refuge in New Orleans East. And the tour is going to leave at 7:30. It's approximately a 3-hour trip. There's room for, I believe, 14 people total. There are 8 canoes. So if you'd like to go on that trip, there's a sign-up sheet and information in the back. Our next speaker, Mr. Lee, or back here somewhere. Oh, here we go. Okay. It's Rob Lee, who I've not had the pleasure of meeting with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of Texas. Hopefully he's going to be able to give us a little update on how many birds are eating up in these pits. I always view the waste storage and disposal pits as basically a contained oil spill, because that's what they look like. And I have observed birds in various states of decomposition and oil soaking in some of these pits. Basically, the birds cannot discern whether or not there's oil on it, and it's not in their ecological makeup to figure out how to deal with it. They cannot degrease themselves very well. And studies done by Fish and Wildlife Service and Patuxent Wildlife Research determined that as few as like 3 drops of Louisiana crude is enough to kill embryo in a duck egg. That when these ducks pick up even a small sheen on the water, bring it back to the nest, it's enough to take out the nest. So just because the birds don't die. But if you figure that, say, only 1 bird a year died in every one of the 20,000 pits that are out there, that's 20,000 birds. And that's just Louisiana. And then we have the thousands in Texas, and particularly in Park, the thousands of pits that are in are proposed to be in Alaska, where the only people that would get out and observe those would be the oil operators, the caribou, and the seals. You have a very serious problem. If we've had the damage that we've had in Louisiana, just think of what it's like up in Alaska. Rob?
Santa Barbara Channel, San Francisco Bay, 7,000 birds. Hamilton Trader, 10,000 birds. Amigo Cadiz, 20,000. Torrey Canyon, 30,000. The North Sea and the Baltic Sea, 130,000. Exxon Valdez, 300,000. Those are the estimates of the total number of birds killed in the major oil spills throughout the world in the last 21 years. That's 497,000 birds. That total is less than the annual total of birds killed in the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Every year, after year, after year. As Willie said, birds can't distinguish between oil and water very well. Oil appears to be water. The visible and ultraviolet reflectance values for oil and water are very similar. It doesn't take much to kill a bird, as Willie said, and they don't have the ability to learn to avoid it. Once they're in the soil, they're dead. They die from dehydration, starvation, toxic ingestion in the winter. They freeze to death in the summer. The pits literally cook the flesh from their bones. In 1969, this was a real issue. I was just starting college in California at that time, and I remember this as the first environmental issue that I was aware of. The National Audubon Society was involved. The Defenders of Wildlife was involved. By 19 1973, the Texas legislature passed regulations to prohibit exposed oil, or let's say, to prohibit these pits from being exposed so that birds can get in them. In effect, they said eliminate these pits. If you can't eliminate them, cover them up. And that's what they did. They netted literally thousands and thousands of acres of pits and tanks in the state of California by 1973. They also worked with California Fish and Game. It wasn't just the state regulating agencies as far as the oil and gas regulation, but it also involved California Fish and Game. They worked together, and it's in the regulations that they'll work together. 1976, Midge Erskine, and she's in the room back there. You should talk to her. She was out in West Texas looking for a wayward whooping crane. And she went to Whalen Lake, and she didn't find the crane, but she found about 150 dead ducks, and they were all covered with oil. They weren't all dead, some of them were still alive. Eventually, they all died from that exposure. For 2 years, she and the special agent from the Fish and Wildlife Service worked to get these large alkali basins, is what they were in West Texas. They were disposing, just like you're disposing in the coastal areas here, they were disposing in these alkali basins. And the pollutants there there is no dilution effect there. This stuff just simply accumulated. They're like giant roach motels. That's exactly what they're like. In addition to just being attracted from water, they collect on the surface seeds and carcasses of birds. These then become attractions to seed eaters and carrion eaters, and many species that you would never believe to eat carrion do eat carrion, and they're attracted. So it's like a black hole. You know, everything comes in alive, but nothing escapes. Well, anyway, in that 2-year period, a lot of public meetings, and they were able pretty much to get these large alkali basins cleaned up. It took 2 years. The Fish and Wildlife Service presented this information on these bird kills to a federal grand jury in Midland. The grand jury no-billed it, meaning that they didn't think it was worthy of prosecution. They said, turn it over to the state regulating agency, which is the Railroad Commission. These are the people that regulated it in the first place. These are the people that allowed that to happen in the first place, even though in many cases it was against existing laws. In 1984, I don't really have any information from 1978 to 1984, but in 1984, then the Railroad Commission prohibited many of these smaller pits. And so they went to open-top storage tanks. It didn't really make much difference. They're still open, they're still exposed, they're still trapping and killing hundreds of thousands of birds every single year. And then from 1984 to 1987, there really isn't much in the record either. A lot of us knew about the problem, but we just we didn't forget about it, we ignored it. And that's the Fish and Wildlife Service ignored it. And many of the groups and organizations that worked on the earlier problems kind of ignored it because it wasn't as visible as it used to be. It wasn't a 200-acre lake that was polluted anymore. It was something the size of this stage, maybe up to the size of this room, or even smaller. The problem is still there. It was still just as bad. It just wasn't visible. It was out of sight. It was out of mind. So then finally, in 1987, I moved to Lubbock, Texas for the specific purpose of addressing this problem. All of a sudden, my government, my agency, said, it's enough of a priority. Let's fund an effort. And so I started looking into this thing and went into the literature and found out a lot about the history of what was going on. Went into the field and saw these areas, found the pits, found the tanks, found the dead birds. I did this for about a year, reported that information to our regional director, and he said, this is bad. We need a solution, and we need it now. And I was ready to, let's go to court. Let's try some more prosecutions. But the strategy we developed was to go to the state regulating agencies, to go to the oil companies, go to the oil industry associations, and ask for their cooperation. The state regulating agency said, if you have a problem with the oil companies, you take it to them. We're not interested. We're not interested in passing any new regulations. We already have regulations. We prohibit the storage of oil and oil waste in open pits. So some of the response was from the major oil companies. A lot of them did respond. They closed some pits. They covered them up. They netted them, similar to what's being done in California. But we gave them a year. The deadline was October 1, 1989, and we think about 3 to 5% compliance in West Texas to eliminate hazards to migratory birds. You have to understand that our jurisdiction, in my jurisdiction as a special agent, isn't regulating the oil industry and what they do with this product. I can only investigate them if they kill migratory birds. And so we kind of went around the back door on this thing. We spent a year, like I say, working with this, and during that year, the response from Texas was as I described. The response from Oklahoma was as I described. New Mexico formed a commission and in a matter of months passed regulations to require netting of existing facilities if they couldn't be eliminated. And those regulations went into effect on September 1st, 1989, and we had an immediate response by the industry. Today, about 98% of all facilities in New Mexico are covered. Research in the late 70s and early 80s indicated 250,000 birds being killed in southeastern New Mexico alone. And that carnage does not exist today. It's gone. Simply because New Mexico was responsive. But like I say, we didn't get that response in Texas and New Mexico. So October the 1st of 1989, we entered what we're calling the enforcement phase. And any birds that we find now, we're prosecuting these companies for killing migratory birds. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act says you can't kill a migratory bird at any time, by any means, in any manner. And you don't have to know if you're doing it or not. It's strict liability. We're enforcing it. There's precedent in appeals courts and Supreme Court to say that this is not unconstitutional. Since October the 1st of 1989, we've prosecuted successfully about 40 companies just in West Texas. What I want to say is that